Hey guys, this is Joe from the Woven Energy podcast, and I wanted to put together a quick message before the main podcast starts and say a huge thank you for taking interest in this project and grabbing a copy of the first episode. It's taken me a long time to persuade Damon, who I'll be interviewing in these podcasts, to do something like this. He is the real deal, if you like, and has a lot of knowledge to part with, and he knows that the majority of shamanism is experiential. The more you actually do, the more you can embody and really understand the stuff we're talking about here. Now, I've got to say, if you are looking for the typical just bang a drum and imagine falling down a hole kind of wet woo-like shamanism, then this podcast is not for you. This is the real stuff, the practical stuff, and we are going to go really deep into what shamanism actually is. So if you're really interested in shamanism and prepared to work hard at the practical techniques and understand that true shamanism will take time, then welcome to the Woven Energy podcast. You are going to get loads out of this podcast. I think the task ahead of us in documenting the entirety of shamanism is such a monumental task and not limited to this episode at all. So listen to it. And I'm going to say thank you so much for being a part of it from the very, very beginning. From the time of recording this intro, I've just finished editing episode 8, and I think we're really hitting our stride. Both of us are a lot more comfortable with what we're doing here, so I can't wait for you guys to listen to them. Listen to the first episode, and then I want you to do something for me. Please email me at Joe, that's Joe, Joe at wovenenergy.com. Joe@wovenenergy.com, and let me know any questions or struggles you have with learning shamanism. I can get them answered for you. If you have any thoughts on the podcast in general, then stick them in that email as well. So again, thanks a lot, guys. This episode covers a lot of ground, so enjoy.
This week on the Woven Energy podcast.
Any kind of meditation that doesn't involve the use of imagination, shamans are some of the most disciplined, tough people you will ever come across. No matter which shamanistic society you're in, this is past stage 4. Yeah. So then we have the journey. And the journey, a lot of people find the journey very difficult. And this is where most people fall by the wayside in practicing shamanism. Human beings are natural animals. Nature is there as a teacher if anybody wants to take nature as a teacher. Some people like the idea of shamanism, but they don't like the reality of it. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a tough old business.
Hey guys, welcome to the Woven Energy podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith, your hosts. This is episode 1, and we are super excited to be starting this podcast. This podcast is going to be everything to do with shamanism, specifically rebuilding the practice, the ideas, the philosophy behind this art from the ground up to provide you with a really good resource to really get to grips with what shamanism used to be. Damon's ideas are fresh and firmly rooted in reality and experience, which was very much in line with my own values. So I'm super excited to bring him on board to talk about shamanism from the ground up. He's studied shamanism extensively, as well as being a practitioner, and I've had plenty of results and experiences from following his advice myself. And he actually told me the other day when we were talking about starting this podcast that some people like the ideas of things, but perhaps not the reality of them. And this sums up this podcast in a nutshell. We might talk about things that you might not want to hear or goes against what you think you already know, but that's the point. So hopefully you can start listening to this podcast with an open mind and a fresh set of ears. And hopefully, just like me, you'll find what Damon has to say very interesting indeed. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Damon Smith. Damon, how are you doing?
I'm good, Joe. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. I am super excited about starting this podcast. So who is Damon Smith and how did he get into shamanism?
Gosh, that's a long story.
It's all right. We've got some time.
I can tell you how I got into shamanism. I went to university 1985. I was practicing martial arts at that time, and I started doing a particular martial art called Xingyi, which is very shamanistic in its nature. So it's based on 12 animals, 12 different animals, and the art's efficacy relies upon taking on the essence or the character of each of these animals in a very shamanistic way.
Okay, you're talking about the animals. I just want to point out something. I see a lot of people getting confused between animism and the animals, thinking that animism is about animals, but it's not necessarily. It's about things being animate, having a soul, having their place in the universe.
Yeah, well, it is and it isn't. In the shamanistic worldview, God or spirit or the thing that underlies nature. So that would be called Tengri in Mongol, is not discontiguous with the universe. It's part of the underlying fabric of the universe and extends throughout the universe. So in the shamanistic worldview, all things share a commonality. And part of that commonality is the ground, the trees, the mountains, the streams, but it's also the animals. And shamanism very much sees human beings as animals. And when you study spirit animals, which are a large part of shamanism, you look at human beings through a different lens, through a lens that's not the lens that we're taught to look at ourselves through as we grow from childhood to adulthood, through various mechanisms, one being education, another being our parents, another being books and movies and
culture.
Culture in the broader sense.
Mm-hmm.
Religion would be another one. The looking from the outside in at human beings as a civilized species, and from the inside out as human beings as animals, is a very enlightening activity. And so I came across this particular martial art that does this in a fairly big way. To be honest, I've done martial arts most of my life.
So this is called Xingyi, yeah?
Yeah, and I've never really come across a more shamanistic art than Xingyi in that time. Yeah. There may be, but I've not come across one. And that led me into a deeper study of shamanism in general. I was interested in the roots of the underlying traditions, what I've come to call esotericism, although of course we're just using words, and words can mean whatever people want them to. But I came to understanding.
Well, that's a huge point you've just talked about there, about seeing the world through language, because language itself can shape the way we see the world, right?
Well, what I came to realize was that when I said I, a large part of the person who thought he was speaking was not me. A very large part of that I was something that I'd been taught to be by culture, by society, by civilization, rather than something that was really me. And that's certainly still true today. And I came to recognize more and more clearly something which the Siberian shamans call uha or erhu, which the Mongolian shamans call tiran or alchben tiran. And this is something that we don't really have any word at all for in English. And I don't believe there's a word for it in French or German or Spanish or any other language of what I would call a settled and civilized people. And I believe there's a good reason why we don't have a word for this, because this is the concept that as we grow, as we learn through our lives, we take on certain things that we don't look at, we don't recognize, that just become part of what we think we are. And those things are often beneficial. I'll give you a good example. I mean, for instance, if you're a young child playing around the oven while the oven's on, your mother may tell you not to go near there because you might hurt yourself, you might burn yourself. You haven't
social learning, right?
Yeah, you
social
haven't
learning.
Actually burnt yourself, but you kind of look up to and respect role models at that point in your life, and you accept these things. So it's good. You don't actually burn yourself. But conversely, what can happen when human beings separate themselves from nature is that we can take on what we believe are self-evident truths, self-evident parts of ourselves that are not as beneficial. So if we look at history, if we go back in history, Inca child sacrifice would be a really good example of that. The people who perpetrated it really sincerely believed that they were doing the right thing. But in actual fact, they were sincerely committing atrocities. And they didn't recognize it because of their social upbringing in what had become a civilized society by that time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned.
So you're saying a civilized society can often ruin our connection to nature. Then it can destroy how we think about things from the perspective of nature. Then
it can't, in actual fact, destroy our connection to nature, because nature is contiguous and we're part of it. What it can do is introduce patterns into our thinking, into our way of being, which are not very helpful. And you can see really why that happens if you go back to, say, Central Eastern Asia, Central Northeastern Asia, 5,000 years ago, in the area of the bend of the Yellow River. You would have seen societies in transition. You would have seen societies like the Yangshao culture, who were inherently shamanistic, but who had invented, I suspect partly with the help of shamans, because shamans tend to be very creative people, this concept called agriculture. And agriculture introduced a factor that had never existed in 2 million years of human evolution before that. And that factor was the agricultural surplus, which today we refer to as wealth.
Yeah.
And that wealth became effectively a form of power. It became a form of power that could be leveraged by individuals who weren't the traditional protectors of the tribal group. The traditional protectors of the tribal group effectively being the shamans. And instead, it introduced a new kind of power within the increasingly large tribal group, because obviously agriculture can support much bigger societies. And this new power were what they call the Wang in China, the kings. And the same thing happened all over the world, in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. And these kings used, if you want to use the broadest possible term, I mean, I don't totally agree that shamanism is a religion, but they used religion in a very different way, and they used culture in a very different way. They used it to preserve their position at the top of the social hierarchy, increasingly, and decreasingly, they used it to protect and see to the welfare of the people who they were responsible for, as it happened, or had been the role of the shaman in previous generations.
Right, okay. Well, you mentioned something there. You're saying, which I'd like to explore a bit. You say shamanism is not a religion. Could you expand on that?
So, again, it depends what you call a religion. But if you think that religion is a set of beliefs, something that you hold to be true, if you think religion is about faith, for instance, then under your definition of religion, shamanism is certainly not a religion. Shamanism is, as Messier Eliade quite rightly pointed out in his wonderful book, shamanism is a set of techniques. It has religious connotations. It started off in hunter-gatherer societies, when I think it was very a relatively pure form of shamanism. It was a set of techniques used by certain members of the tribe in order to ensure the survival of the tribe. As we moved to pastoral societies, then the role of the shaman was still there, but pastoral societies have a certain level of comfort that hunter-gatherer societies don't necessarily enjoy, in that they have ready access to food when they need it, food and drink when they need it. And in those societies, shamans started to take on a more of a philosophical or moral role within the group, in addition to their role as what you would call a pure shaman. And then as agriculture came along, they or others around them developed this idea based on ethics and morality to a much greater extent, in support of the new kings, the agricultural surplus controllers. And as they did that, the concept of it's a lot easier to get people believing things in order to control, so that they self-control themselves, to get them to take on belief patterns that tend to support the interests of the ruling elites, rather than them having any kind of direct interaction with the natural world, which would tend to support the good of the group as a whole, but not necessarily preserve the position of the elites within society.
Okay, so you talk about agriculture and how it had an effect on ideas based on beliefs and ethics. How about we talk a little bit about the miasma, or what you call the miasma, which could be likened to maybe social conditioning, or how culture can bias our view of the world. I'm pretty sure this subject's going to occupy many future episodes, but how about we talk about the miasma from a shamanistic point of view?
So again, the miasma is not a very good word. It's just the closest thing we've got in English. So as I said, the miasma relates to human constructed patterns as opposed to nature constructed patterns. There are much better words in the languages of peoples who are shamanistic. So, and actually it's quite interesting that in English, we don't really have a word for this. Whereas in Mongol, for instance, we got Tiran, Achben Tiran, Chutkur, Mo Nochlo, Totkur, Ado Ad Shaglurlich. All of these are words for something that we haven't even got a concept of in English. And that in itself should tell us something. It should tell us what's happened within our society. But the miasma is a very difficult thing to deal with from a shamanistic point of view, because shamanism was never designed to deal with the miasma. Shamanism was designed to deal with the situation where very, very small groups of, maybe 10 to 14 people are moving around in a big, wide, frankly, fairly dangerous world. And they don't have very much of a safety net to fall back on. So decisions had to be made by the shamans, who were the strategic leaders of the group. Not necessarily later on, they weren't necessarily the actual chieftain, although it seems that very early on the chieftain and the shaman were one and the same thing, and that this sort of diverged at a later time, possibly with the introduction of pastoralism. But the role of the shaman was to support, protect, care for the group as a whole. In order to do that, the shaman took on a very, very, very close relationship with nature. The shaman learned through a process to shut down the normal categorization and filtering that the brain does to sensory information in order to help us to simplify things, to make things easier to remember. The shaman would learn to shut that down in order to see nature much more directly, to see it in an unfiltered way. And the shaman would use a wide variety of different techniques. One would be Arum Shtayan Amtan, which is to take on the sense of an animal, of a wild animal. Or famously, there are psychoactive substances that were used by shamans for similar kind of purposes. But effectively what the shaman was doing was ridding himself of the miasma, ridding himself of his social conditioning, of his judgments, of his categorizations, of his
cultural biases,
exactly. And but at every level, I don't just mean in his mind, I mean in his spirit, in his body, in all ways. And having achieved that state, taking nature unfiltered and experiencing it unfiltered. So when he came back from that state, he picked up on very often very, very subtle cues within nature's complex, rich cues within natural patterns that the members of the tribe themselves may not be able to pick up on, and it gave him a kind of strategic advantage. He just knew in his bones that, for instance, it might be better to go to one place rather than another in order to survive the winter, for instance.
It would be a feeling, right? It wouldn't be like...
it's shamanistic technique is experiential. True shamanistic technique always has a purpose. It's not undirected. It's a very, very directed thing. And I think this is one of the things that gets missed when talking about shamanism in a theoretical sense. I mean, I studied shamanism at university as well as practicing it. And it's very, very easy to get caught up in the phenomenology of shamanism. So, for instance, we could describe the differences between the shamans of Mongolia and the shamans of Siberia. But actually, they've got so much in common that the differences are almost not worth discussing. They're so trivial, but in a academic setting, you have to pick up on something. You have to describe something. If you're not practicing, you're seeing shamanism from the outside in and not from the inside out. When you see it from the inside out, you start to realize that it is one thing. And I think you said, when you look at a map of the world and you see, for instance, the major religions, they often color in different patches of the world in different colors. So I guess you would say most of Europe would be, say, red for Christianity, something like that. And it shows you how cultures spread. Cultures spread from person to person. But when you take
spread from an idea, right? Spread from ideas,
from one person giving somebody a piece of information to another person. But when you take shamanism, again, difference between shamanism and other inverted commas religions is that it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like somebody's taken the world and lightly sprinkled it with a pepper pot. There's not much shamanism anywhere in the world, but what there is scattered all over the places. It's in South America, it's in North America, it's in Siberia, it's in, Africa, everywhere all over the globe. You'll find little pockets of shamanism. And apart from the phenomenology, apart from those little things, what do they make their little trinkets out of? Actually, it's all the same. All the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's what drew me into shamanism in the first place. It's like, no matter where you look, no matter which shamanistic practice you look at, if you strip away all those layers, you end up with the same core. And I don't think anything else kind of has that quality.
Well, the only other place you get it is the other thing that you mentioned, which is animism. Animism is unlike shamanism. Animism is a religion of sorts. It's the oldest religion of human beings, and it's simply the religion that nature is divine. It's that we come from nature, and therefore, in some way, nature is our parent, our creator, and that. I guess you could say it's the religion in which everybody can directly see God at all times, because God is the trees, the streams, the mountain, and again, to contrast it with some religions that were created once civilization, i.e. agriculturally driven, the agriculturally driven development of civilization started off. But of course, when that happened, shamanism didn't die out entirely. It was heavily suppressed, but it didn't die out entirely. What it tended to do was go underground. And this is where we get the rise of what I describe as esotericism. So this is esoteric groups, some secret societies in different places around the world, also some branches of major religions that behave in a more shamanistic, animistic type of way. As I said, I group them all together in the term esotericism. Again, we could argue over terms, but those groups then started asking themselves, well, what relevance does shamanistic technique have within settled societies? What relevance does, for instance, shamanism have living in the middle of London, with tens or hundreds of thousands of people all around you, when shamanism developed from nature in order to protect small groups of 10 to 20?
So, you were talking about shamans in tribes, in tribal societies. How how would a shaman, and I'm using the term shaman lightly because, as we know, shamanism is a modern term, but how does one know they're a shaman, or how would a group or a tribe know who their shaman was within the tribe?
Okay, so I believe, or my experience would lead me to believe, because I've been through this myself, that anybody has the potential to be a shaman. There are cultural norms established within long-term shamanistic societies that would tend to suggest that somebody is born to be a shaman. I see these as sort of a miasma light. I think this is the start of a kind of miasmatic way of seeing the world. Human beings are natural animals. Nature is there as a teacher if anybody wants to take nature as a teacher. So every society, every shamanistic society has a kind of process, whether it's explicit or implicit, that a person would go through in order to become a shaman. You could call it an apprenticeship. You could call it a study process. You could just call it something that happens to people as they move towards shamanism. That process tends to have around about 7 steps in it, depending on where you are in the world. And they're not always named, and they're not always recognized as such. But
well, this number 7 is an interesting one. It crops up all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah,
in various esoteric teachings.
Well, and exoteric as well. I mean, you know, the for instance, the Christian and Judaic scriptures, the heptatical, what they call the heptatical nature of the scriptures is quite widely known. To me, the process is one. It's not 7. It's one process. And there are various different aspects and various different ways it can be achieved. So I personally have tried quite a few different ways of achieving the shamanistic state. But as you alluded to, my specialty, my forte is Arumstein Amtan, or the spirit animals. Mm-hmm. And I use as my primarily esoteric vehicle animal dance or animalistic dance, a kind of spirit dance, a shamanistic dance. But that's my choice. That's my preference. There are many, many ways to achieve that. And it is definitely a learned set of techniques. It's somebody can teach you these. So, for instance, if I take a series of 7, Bagtamstesal is kind of the first stage. That would be it literally means something like a capacious container. You turn yourself into an empty container. This is kind of an allusion to getting rid of what's inside you, what you've learned, in order that nature can then come in and fill that space. Then we have Amskar, which is the breath, the breathing, the breath, the song, the rhythm, the heart. These things are very, very important in shamanistic technique because they are creating a platform within the human being for that interaction within nature, because in the natural world.
Well, the rhythm's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think when our listeners get to a certain stage and when we get into the practical stuff and they start feeling that rhythm, it's something that we're going to explore time and time again. It's it's almost an indicator that you're getting somewhere.
Yeah, so that within human beings is what's called in Mongol ashjim. It's a vitality, it's life, it's a kind of energy, though you've got to be careful again when you use that word.
Yeah.
But it's in human beings and it's in nature. So the shamanistic technique, it partly involves around the interaction between the if you like, the microcosm and the macrocosm, the interaction between the vitality, the ashtim that's going on inside human beings, and the vitality or eshtim that's going on inside nature. And in a lot of shamanistic technique is built upon an initial foundation of those two things crossing each other. The patterns within nature crossing over the patterns within a natural human being. That empty state that I referred to, I've sometimes referred to that by a made-up word like chicity, the nature of being like a chalice, like an empty chalice. The movement, the rhythm, the energy patterns, they create something that we call a vessel. We use this word in English for want of a better word. It's quite a difficult thing to describe again in English. But in the dance, in the
spirit dance.
For me, because I do spirit dance, is literally a dance, yeah. But it can be a dance of music, it can be a dance of rhythm, it can be a dance of color, of patterns.
Hence the shaman's drum, right? That constant boom, boom,
so
boom, boom.
in the dance, the breath locks in. So the amska locks in with the tsam, the dance, and this creates a weave. A kind of weave, guruch in Mongol. This weave is the energy patterns that, again, careful with the word energy, that cross over each other, and start to form a structure. They form a structure that allows modoch, which is the ability to mount or slip onto that forming structure. People perceive it in many different ways. What actually happens is your mind tries to make sense of what's happening. And because you're not used to a shamanistic state, it's not something that most people have experienced in their lives, to be honest, or few have experienced infrequently. It's not at what civilized people would call a normal state. The brain tries to make sense of it, and it's very, very hard to make sense of because the brain's not used to it. What's actually happening is you're stepping outside the continual cycle of analysis, of judgment, and you're getting a more direct involvement with nature. And so you can perceive that as a, I guess someone could perceive it as in Chinese, ancient China, they used to perceive it as a qilin, the shaman would mount the back of the qilin and the qilin would fly off into the clouds. Qilin's like a Chinese unicorn. And then he would arrive at an audience chamber where he would have a direct audience with lords who moved like dark ships behind screens. It's ways that the shaman's brain is trying to make sense of what's happening. Some people might see a tunnel. Some people might find themselves flying off into the clouds. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the vessel is simply a way of stepping outside of your normal state of, inverted commas, reality. So then the next stage is Ailal. This is the journey.
So is this stage 4?
No, this would be up to it depends. See, the numbers
it's hard,
are not
isn't
important,
it?
But this is past.
Yeah.
No matter which shamanistic society you're in, this is past stage 4. Yeah. So then we have the journey. And the journey, a lot of people find the journey very difficult. And this is where most people fall by the wayside in practicing shamanism. Because when you're in that state, I know what you're going to say because I know you have some experience of this yourself. When you're in that state, there are significant distractions. I don't know if you want to give some of your own experience in that state.
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to be in this state, your mind just decides to be really, really annoying and it throws all sorts at you. So you might see things that aren't there, patterns start emerging, things merge into one. I remember when I was doing this looking over a lake once, and I wasn't on any kind of psychoactive substance or anything, but lots of the wind that came across all the waves, they would get much bigger than they perhaps were, and they all sort of merged into each other, and it was kind of a strange optical illusion. But again, that distracted me. Not only visual stuff, but you get like thought loops happening and maybe a touch of anxiety, and there's all sorts of stuff which comes and tries to distract you. And it's really funny when I talk to you about this stuff, because you're always like, no, irrelevant, move on, push past it. So yeah,
it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing. I mean, it's quite interesting. There's a marketing guru called Seth Godin. Nothing to do with shamanism, but I think
amazing guy.
Yeah, he is an amazing guy, and he has a concept of a purple cow, and the idea is you traveling along in the car, passing fields full of ordinary brown cows. And then you get a bit bored of them after a while, and you stop noticing them, even though they're there. But then one time you come across a purple cow and you notice it. And what you get very much when you enter that high state is you start the spirit journey. You get a lot of purple cows, and that's where shamanism really falls down. This is where the miasma really kicks in. What happens is that when people start thinking about this stuff, the shamanistic state collapses. Or if they're using a psychoactive substance, the shamanistic state doesn't head in a good direction. And again, for instance,
it's hard to take it in a good direction, isn't it? On psychoactive, because it becomes harder to control it
without a purpose. It's impossible. It's not just hard. Without a purpose, it's impossible. And the most important thing to achieve the highest state of the nechtel, the highest state of shamanism, is that purpose. It's the discipline. Shamans are not recreational drug users. Shamans are some of the most disciplined, tough people you will ever come across. They are, if you like, the special forces of the spiritual world. They are so tough, and that's what differentiates them. In that space, they have a purpose. It's directed, and they will not be distracted from that purpose under any circumstances, especially not by a purple cow.
Yeah. And what you're saying is psychoactive substances, when we take psychoactive substances, they facilitate that distraction, right?
No, not necessarily. What it is they actually facilitate the stage before that, the modach. That's the ability to mount or slip onto the vessel, or to create the vessel. So this
is going back to the rhythm. This is going back to the rhythm concept.
The rhythm is one of many means, because when you say rhythm, it suggests a musical rhythm. It's a shaman beating on his black bull hide drum, There's a rhythm in the dance, yeah? For instance, there may be no music playing at all, but there can still be a rhythm in the dance. But
something I've experienced with the rhythm, and I know I'm bringing this up again, but I think our audience will find it useful when they get to a certain stage with their shamanism, is something very hypnotic. Side. It just keeps building and building and building and building.
That helps with the Bagtamstesab, with the chillicity. It really helps because, for instance, if you just try to do ordinary meditation, like Zen type of meditation, sometimes it's quite hard to empty your mind. But if you breathe slowly to a count, although the count is mental activity, it distracts you from other more complex types of mental activity. So the regular quality of the rhythm can be very beneficial especially when somebody's starting out in shamanism, because distractions, to be honest, are the single biggest barrier to somebody moving from somebody who's interested in shamanism to somebody being a shaman. It's a lot of the process, that 7, if you want to count it as 7 stages, a lot of that process is about learning discipline. It's almost like a military boot camp. And this is, I think you jokingly said, that I'd said one time. What was that? I said, some people like the idea of shamanism, but they don't like
So
the reality of it. Yeah.
Yes.
It's
yes,
a tough old business. It really, really is tough.
Well, I think a lot of people have the idea that shamanism is, and it is to a certain aspect of like going off and respecting nature and having a good time. But that's not what it is it? It's much darker.
No,
it can be much darker.
That is nothing wrong with that. I mean,
absolutely. That's what I meant. There's nothing wrong with it.
Going off into the wilds, going up a mountain, it's great. I love it. Being by yourself, alone, one with nature, but don't mistake that for shamanism. That is animism.
Would you call that more? Yeah, I was going to say, would you call that more animism than shamanism?
Yeah, that is animism. Yeah, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Shamans were spiritual specialists in spiritual techniques who lived within and protected animistic societies originally.
So let's say, I mean, we've touched on it just now, but let's say somebody is interested in shamanism. You said somebody who's got, the journey from somebody who's interested in shamanism to somebody to become a shaman. So what would be something that somebody who's interested in shamanism, what would be something they could do to actually learn more about shamanism? Apart from, of course, listening to this amazing podcast. But are there any books worth looking at?
Well, there are some very, very good books about shamanism. My personal favorite is Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. I think because of his work, because of his academic interests, his view of shamanism is a little slanted, but it certainly is a very valid view of shamanism. The other book is Eliade's Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Fantastic work. But what I'd also say is you will not learn shamanism by reading those books. You will, and this is part of the miasma. We very often think that by categorizing something, we've understood it. I'll give you a very simple example. Once I was, many years ago, it's really about early to mid 1990s, I was on the tennis courts in Leeds practicing some Xingyi with a good friend of mine. And somebody came over to us and said, and asked, "Is that judo?" And not being very fast thinking like my companion, I was about to start explaining that no, it wasn't judo. It was a rather different art called Xingyi. And but my quick-witted colleague immediately jumped in and said yes. To which the person smiled and said, "Oh," and then walked off. Happy that he correctly categorized what we were doing, because now he understood what we were doing. He thought he had fitted it into his worldview, into his miasma. Now, of course, I'm not criticizing the guy. There's nothing wrong with that. I do the same stuff every day. What I am saying is that that's an example of the miasma at work, and my rather clever colleague exploited that in order to, because he basically wanted to get rid of the guy quite quickly so he could keep practicing. Clever guy. So what I would say is that read the books, get interested. If they make you enthused, then great. But the first thing you've got to do is start getting rid of stuff. That's really what shamanism's about. The first step along the way is the ability to develop chicity. Sorry, Joe.
I was saying I like the phrase cleansing the dust, or like sweeping away the dust.
Yeah, and that's not something that anybody can do. I mean, we all have lives, you all have jobs, you all have things that we have to deal with, and it's not the easiest thing to do. But what I can do is tell you what the components of that are, the components of chicity, or at least some of the components. Yeah. So one of the components is obviously this ability to shut down your thoughts. Now, any kind of meditation that doesn't involve imagination or imagining things, just straightforward Zen meditation is going to help with that. You've got to develop the ability to sit quietly and just think of nothing, do absolutely nothing. And there's lots of resources out there that can teach you how to do that.
So it's specifically Zen meditation. We're not talking about
No,
we're not
it's
talking
not
about these guided
specifically-
meditations.
It's any kind of meditation that doesn't involve the use of imagination or imagining clouds or imagining beaches or anything
Visual
like that.
meditation.
That will not help you with shamanism. It may help you reduce your stress level, but it won't help you with shamanism.
I'll tell you what does happen though, because when I first started practicing meditation like this, it naturally went in that direction. So I found it easier to concentrate on one thing when it was inherently visual rather than thinking of nothing. And that's something that's happened to me for a while, and I need to try and, claw my way out of that. But
Sure.
I found it naturally happened over time. I'd start trying to think about nothing, and then the visuals would come in. Now, I was 100% focused on those visuals, but it was those visuals.
So when they come, you don't fight against them because you won't win that battle. When they come, you acknowledge their presence and then just forget about them. Allow them to dissipate. In order to help you do that, there are certain components to chicity. It's not one thing. Well, it is one thing, but it sort of has components. So let me give you 3 components. One component is bat in Mongol. In a simplistic translation in English, it means strength. But it really means steadfastness, discipline, or the word paragality is a word that I've used. It's that determination. It's the focus. It's the strength of character that a shaman needs in order to achieve their purpose and not be distracted by the many, many distracting things that happen in a shaman's world. The second component of chicity, or a second component of chicity, is toshiltin. Again, not really any English translation, but it's essentially an explorative, self-experimental view of the world. So one of the ways that I think of toshiltin is that if you imagine science, its attitude is to conduct experiments, or at least as scientists would probably say it should be correctly applied. First to conduct experiments, then to gather results, and only after having seen the evidence, then try to come up with some understanding based on those results, some analysis and some theories, which can then be challenged by further experimentation. Now, if you take that concept and instead of being an experimenter who's observing the experiment, you become a participative part at the center of the experiment, then that's close to the attitude of toshiltin. But it also has a playfulness, a free abandon. If you imagine a child just having fun, laughing, joking, running through the mountains, the child sees a butterfly flying in a meadow. The child will just chase the butterfly. They won't have a committee meeting about the ethics of butterfly chasing, or think to themselves, maybe somebody's going to see me and I'm going to look after. No, they'll just go after the butterfly. Also, if a baby or a young child has a cookie put in front of it, it isn't going to go, I wonder how many calories are in that cookie. It's just going to grab the cookie and eat it. Yeah, this
being in the moment,
this playfulness, it's a playfulness with the moment. It's going into a situation, first of all, like the situation is new, but also like, what can I make out of this? How can this be made alive? What's the life in this situation? But again, it's that question is not really being answered when you asked or answered when you're in that state. It's just something that's happening. It's a playfulness. It's like two tiger cubs fighting with each other. They're not really fighting. They're even at that age, they're probably able to kill each other. They're just play fighting. They're experimenting. They're finding out about the world, but they're getting feedback because there's nature there. Their fellow tiger cub, who's giving them feedback about what they're doing, and then later when they become real hunters or they have to protect themselves, then all those skills that they picked up, that knowledge and understanding that they picked up in an intuitive, playful way, it stays with them, and it's there when they need it for real, when they need it when there's danger. And this is the same with shamans. There's a playfulness in shamanism. Most shamans are actually pretty funny people. They have a not a sense of humor, but a vitality for life, an experimental vitality. So what I would say is, for instance, one thing you can practice is when you walk into a place that you've known for years, see it like it's new. I don't mean analyze it in your brain. I mean, just literally see it like it's new, like as if you were walking into a place that you've never been before. And then the third component I would mention is a guchach. That's a tricky one. This is what shaman picks up through the apprenticeship, through the long disciplined years, through the hard work. Unfortunately, guchach doesn't come in a bottle. But what it is it's accumulation of direct experience. Rather than the accumulation of learned knowledge, it's the accumulation of direct experience. And over time, no matter what you do, no matter what shamanistic techniques or methods you follow, whatever techniques you apply, there's a preparatory thing inherent within it. It's a bit like a bottle of wine, you know. I guess a noble Burgundy would taste pretty nice when it's first been made, but when you've laid it down for a few years, it takes on a character. It takes on a guchach, and that is another component of chillicity. It's a deep experience of what it is that shamans do. It's a deep experience of trying and hopefully sometimes succeeding to step out of your own miasma, and into
being on a mission free from social conditioning.
Yeah. So in Japanese shamanic understanding, they call this the Tokoyo no Kuni. Not to say that there's a lot of shamanism goes on in Japan these days, but there is some. And Tokoyo no Kuni literally means the yonder realm. You're stepping outside of the mundane world and into what people would call the realm of the spirit, the realm of Setel in Mongol. And in that realm, you put yourself in a position where deliberately put yourself in a position where you're gaining feedback from the natural world, from Tengri in Mongol, that is the underlying spirit, the underlying driver with it that extends throughout the whole of nature. And then, so if you put those things together, Bat, Toshiltin, and Guchach, those three things support that concept of the chalice. If you like, it's almost like, you know, the stem of the chalice, like holding it there, that supports it, that allows it to do its function of being a chalice. The bat, it has the chalice has strength, it has integrity. Toshiltin, it's empty, it's ready to be filled. And Guchach, it was made by a long, careful process. It's a good chalice. Yeah. So that's how I would describe the starting point in moving towards becoming a shaman. I mention that largely because the pitfalls in trying to become a shaman, especially in a society like ours, or in any settled civilized society, are that we will view it through our cultural filters, through our lens. And that happens also don't think that doesn't happen in animistic societies. It does. It's just the degree to which it happens.
It happens over time, doesn't it? You could have the purest of
sure.
a person, and it just over
But your
time.
weapon against that is chillicity.
Mm. So to develop chillicity is to develop the skills necessary to move forward towards using shamanism effectively and shamanistic technique.
To me, that would be the first step.
Yeah. Right then.
There are more.
And I'm sure we'll start discussing all those as well in future episodes. But yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic. So thanks very much, Damon. And
My pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of many. So I think this has been a good episode. It's laid the foundation for what we're going to be talking about in the future, and it's not gone into anything in tremendous depth. Well, I mean, I hope to some people that's a tremendous amount of depth, but I know that there's a lot more to come. So I'm looking forward to keeping going. And yeah, let's leave it there, and we'll see you in episode 2.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joe.
Hey guys, I really hope you enjoyed episode 1. There should be plenty more episodes out now, so go ahead and go and check those out. You can go to the website at www.wovenenergy.com to stay up to date with the latest episodes. You can see how far we've got. Join the mailing list, see the show notes for each episode, so you can stay up to date. And occasionally we send out exclusive content, so be sure to check that out. Thanks so much, guys. Keep listening. See you soon.